Welcome to section 7.7, Respiration, Circulation, and Excretion. We're going to be talking about 3 different body systems, so it's a little bit long. We're going to just give a brief overview of each of these. Let's start with the respiratory system. The respiratory system is responsible for gas exchange. So, it is the respiratory system that where we talk about our lungs and about breathing, about the oxygen and the air that goes into our lungs. So let's take a look at the path that the air follows when it travels to our lungs. It goes down into the pharynx, which is also the sometimes called the throat, right here, past the epiglottis. Remember, the epiglottis is that flap of skin that when we swallow covers the pathway to the lungs so that food doesn't accidentally go into the lungs. Air then travels through the larynx, right here, and down the trachea. Here's the trachea. Sometimes that's called the windpipe. Then it travels through both bronchi. Here's one bronchus. If we talk about 2 of them, they're called bronchi for the plural. And then the air goes into both lungs right here. What are the bronchi? Each of the bronchus branches into little bronchioles, which are narrower passageways, and from there they branch into numerous microscopic tubules that continue to narrow through here until they become what we call alveoli. And the alveoli inside of the lungs are tiny, tiny sacs where the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are exchanged between the air and the blood via diffusion. Remember, we're talking about diffusion. You guys all know what that is. So these alveoli, these tiny little sacs, are surrounded by tiny little blood vessels called capillaries. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the circulation system. The wall of each alveolus and each capillary are only 1 cell thick, and that is the point at which the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are exchanged between the air in the lungs and the blood in our blood vessels. The diaphragm is a very important muscle. It's right here, right underneath the lungs. It allows inhalation and exhalation to occur. When the diaphragm contracts, it flattens and it moves lower, moves down in the chest cavity. That forces the space here to increase, the space where the lungs are, and because of that, air rushes into the lungs because they are now a region of lower pressure than air outside of the body. When the diaphragm relaxes, it rises back up and it actually pushes the air out and the lungs exhale, and that is the mechanism by which we breathe. So is breathing voluntary or involuntary? Well, usually it's involuntary. Our bodies continue to breathe, whether we're thinking about it or not. It can be controlled, however. It's partially controlled. The involuntary portion is partially controlled by an internal feedback mechanism that involves signals being sent to the medulla oblongata in our brains about the chemistry of the blood. And when we are lacking oxygen, or if the medulla oblongata senses that there is a need for more oxygen, it will increase the rate of breathing. So how do lungs stay clean? Well, the nasal cavity and the trachea and the bronchi are all lined with ciliated cells that secrete mucus. Those cilia are constantly beating upward in the direction of the throat, where foreign material could be swallowed or expelled by coughing or sneezing. And that is how our bodies naturally keep our lungs clean. Smoking is actually an act that destroys the tiny cilia hairs. So that's dangerous. It puts an individual at risk for the developing lung cancer, chest infection, and other lung diseases because the dirt and the pollution stay in the lungs, along with other chemicals from the smoke that are being smoked. So it's definitely not a healthy thing to be doing to your lungs. It's very damaging. Asthma is a chronic condition, and it has an effect that it has on the lungs as well. When people who have asthma have a trigger that it will cause the airways to make extra mucus. It's kind of a different problem. That extra mucus narrows the space for the air to move in and out of the lungs. There's also swelling that is involved, makes breathing difficult. So individuals who have asthma oftentimes have a difficult time breathing, and this is the reason why. So as we've said already, respiratory and circulatory systems work very closely together. We've seen that as we've mentioned the interface between the alveoli and the capillaries, and we will see in a moment how the circulation system continues to work very closely with the respiratory system. Now let's talk about the human circulatory system, and I'm sure you all already know it's made up of the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. The circulatory system is responsible for carrying oxygen, nutrients, and chemicals to the body's cells. It also carries away the cell waste and protects the body via white blood cells and blood clotting mechanisms. So let's look at the components of blood first. That's a big component of the circulatory system. Blood is composed of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Red blood cells transport oxygen and some carbon dioxide. They lack a nucleus and they contain hemoglobin, which is necessary to transport the oxygen. White blood cells are very large. There are several different types of white blood cells, and they all contain nuclei, and they help defend the body against disease. Platelets are cell fragments that are needed for blood clotting. Plasma is liquid and contains proteins. It transports red and white blood cells, platelets, nutrients, enzymes, hormones, gases, and inorganic salts. It's the liquid in which everything flows in the blood. Here's just a little breakdown of how much of each of these substances is in blood. Let's look now at the blood typing systems by which we classify different people's bloods. There are 4 human blood groups. We term them A, B, AB, and O. The differences are due to the presence or absence of what we call antigens. Antigens are proteins that stimulate immune response. A and B stand for the type of antigen found on the surface of the human red blood cells. So if we look here, blood type A has blood cells that contain A antigens on the surface. Blood type B contains B antigens. Blood type AB contains both A and B antigens. And blood type O does not have any antigens on the surface of the blood cells. So an individual's plasma contains antibodies to the other antigens. For example, if a person is blood type A, their plasma has antibodies to the B antigens. An antigen mixed with its antibody causes the blood to clump and not function properly. So it's very important that when blood transfusion happens, that people receive the correct blood type. More on the blood typing system has to do with what is called the Rh factor. So a person's blood will be categorized as either A, B, AB, O, and then the Rh factor will be included. Either it will be a positive or a negative. Rh positive is if the Rh antigen is on the surface of the blood cells, and Rh negative if there is no Rh antigen on the surface of the blood cells. This can be problematic during pregnancy, and the reason is that this is a potential scenario, and there are measures that can be taken to prevent catastrophes from happening. But if the mother is exposed to Rh antigens at the birth of the baby, and the mother happens to be Rh negative, her exposure to the Rh positive antigens will then cause her body after birth, subsequently, to create anti-Rh antibodies. Then, during a second pregnancy, if the fetus is Rh positive, the antibodies in her blood will attack it and damage it. If this ends up being a scenario, doctors are very careful to check, and medication can be given to the mother to prevent her body from producing Rh antibodies so that the baby will not be harmed. Now let's take a look at the heart. First, before we do that, let's just clarify two terms. Arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart, and veins carry deoxygenated blood from all the tissues back toward the heart. So arteries go away, veins go toward. Capillaries are 1 cell thick, and remember we just talked about those. As the arteries narrow down, they narrow all the way into 1 cell thick capillary tubes. So now let's look at the heart itself and the path of blood as it travels through the heart. Let's look at the veins that are returning with blood back to the heart. It needs to be oxygenated, and we have the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Those are veins that are returning with blood from all over the body. They enter the heart in the right atrium. The heart has 2 atria, and it has 2 ventricles. The ventricles tend to be larger, larger, thicker muscle because they work harder than the atria. But as the blood comes back, it enters the right atrium, and then it travels into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it is pumped to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. It's going to go away from the heart now, and it's going to go into the lungs. This artery is carrying blood to the left lung, and over here we are going to the right lung. Once the blood is oxygenated at the point of capillaries and alveoli in the lungs, it comes back through here. These places, the pulmonary veins. It's going to carry blood back to the heart. Now it's oxygenated blood, though. Okay, it's coming back into the heart and into the left atrium. So blood enters the heart in the atriums and it exits through the ventricles. So we are now in the left atrium. Blood is then pumped to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, blood is pumped through the aorta out into all parts of the body. That is the pathway for the blood through the heart. It is how blood returns to the heart, is pumped to the lungs, becomes oxygenated, and then is pumped back out into the rest of the body. So a pulse is the surge of blood through an artery each time the heart beats. Each time the heart beats, a surge of blood flows from the left ventricle into the arteries. Every single time. Every single time the heart beats, there is a movement of the blood in each of these places through the heart. A pulse is the surge of blood through an artery each time the heart beats. Blood pressure is the force that the blood exerts on the blood vessels. It rises and falls as the heart contracts and relaxes. The sinoatrial node, that is not on this diagram, but it is an important node. It is a bundle of nerves, nerve cells at the very top of the right atrium. So it rests up above the right atrium, and it is often called the pacemaker. It generates electrical signals that cause both of the atria to contract simultaneously, 70 to 80 impulses per minute. And since that as the pacemaker controls the heartbeat, the medulla oblongata controls the pacemaker. Now finally, we are coming to the excretory system. The excretory system is responsible for filtering blood to remove the wastes. So the excretory system contains 2 kidneys, a bladder, and tubes that connect these together and exit the body. So let's first look at each kidney. Here are 2 kidneys located on each side of the spine. This one is sliced open just so that you can see what it would look like inside. They're each connected to a ureter, here and here. Each ureter is a tube that leads to the bladder, right here, and waste exits the body through the urethra, that tube there. The bladder is a smooth muscle bag. It stores all of the solution full of wastes, and nephrons are the functional units of the kidney. Filtration and reabsorption take place in each nephron. So the kidney is made up of many, many, many tiny nephrons. How the kidney works over an overall view, blood with waste products enters the kidney, and the kidney filters it via all of these tiny little nephrons, and clean blood then exits the kidney and goes back into circulation. Let's take a look at the structure of a nephron. Here would be what a nephron looks like, and this part of the nephron is called the Bowman's capsule. As blood cells enter into this Bowman's capsules, the blood cells and the proteins of themselves are too large to pass through capillary walls. Instead, small molecules, urea, water, salts, and other nutrients will leave the capillaries and enter the nephron tubules here. In tan color, they're represented. As these small molecules enter the nephron tubules, most of the liquid in the materials gets reabsorbed into the bloodstream by diffusion or active transport, depending on what is appropriate for the molecule. The remaining liquid left over is what is called urine, and it travels out here and will end up going to the ureter and then be stored in the bladder. Urine contains ammonia and urea. They are nitrogenous waste products, and they are the major products in urine. They are very toxic to the body, and so they are eliminated from the body. In addition to regulating ammonia and urea, which are nitrogenous wastes, kidneys also regulate some other things. They regulate sodium levels in the blood because they reabsorb sodium ions. So that is how they are able to regulate the sodium levels. They also regulate the pH of the blood. They filter out hydrogen ions and cause changes in blood pH. Kidneys do not usually filter glucose. Therefore, individuals that have diabetes, they have excess levels of glucose in their blood and will often perform urine tests to see what their blood glucose levels are because the kidneys do not regulate that. Kidney dialysis is an artificial process for removing waste and excess water from the blood. Individuals who have kidney damage and whose kidneys do not function properly will need kidney dialysis to artificially have their the waste removed from their body. So some advanced ideas for you. There are a lot in this. We just touched the surface, and we really did not go into much depth on any of these systems. So anything that you come up with on your own, any ideas you have, any questions, please research that further for advanced proficiency. You could look at circulatory disorders like heart attack and stroke. You could look at causes and effects of diabetes and treatments. You could look at the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system of the blood. We didn't talk about that at all, but it's an important mechanism also for maintaining the pH in the body. You could create a model of the heart showing the pathway of the blood. That would be wonderful. So I look forward to seeing what you come up with, and we'll see you in class.